It's another spooky themed Dungeons and Dragons video as we talk about demonic possession, vampires, and more today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. Today I'm going to be doing a quicker video than usual, talking about some early Halloween-themed concepts that were presented in Dragon Magazine, specifically this time talking mostly about demons, devils, demonic possession, and then also vampires. So again, this is October of 2024. Today is October 28th, and this is going to be the last of my sort of Halloween-themed videos, I guess until next year at the same time. So I've done a few Halloween-themed videos before. This month I've done one on the complete book of Necromancers from 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I've done one looking at the history of witches, specifically the witch class for NPCs, could also be used for player characters, but they were usually presented as an NPC class, as presented mostly in early issues of Dragon Magazine. And then I've also done a video just recently where I talked with William W. Connors, who was one of the three kind of core designers behind the 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Ravenloft line. So there were many more designers than Bill and two of his other comrades, but they were sort of known as being the core three. And so I'm friends with Bill, and I talked to him about his experiences on Dragonlance on Ravenloft, and how that came to be and how he came to work on it and some of his favorite products from that era. So definitely you're going to want to check that out. And then also all the way back last year, October of 2023, in one of my DM advice videos, I talked about a Halloween themed session that I ran for my daughter and her friends. At the time, they would have been 14. And the D&D game I run for them, it's BX 1981 Molde basic D&D, but really the video is just more about advice on how to run a scary sort of thematic a session. And so they wanted a Halloween session sort of inserted into, they didn't want a separate one shot. They just wanted a themed session for that in the middle of that campaign. And so knowing that that's what they wanted, I was able to foreshadow getting up to that point over the few previous sessions so that it didn't come out of nowhere. And they really, really enjoyed it. Okay, but today what I'm going to be talking about, again, are some articles in some early issues of Dragon Magazine. Now, if you like this kind of history or the DM advice, and I also do reviews of tabletop role-playing game products, please give a like to this video. Make sure that you subscribe and then hit the bell icon so that you'll be notified when I upload new videos. Doing all of those things, especially within the first few hours of a new video being posted, just really helps small channels like mine. So make sure that if you enjoy content like this, not just on my channel, but from other smaller channels, make sure to just do that. Even if you can't watch the video at the time, giving it a like and making sure that you've subscribed to the channel really helps. Okay, so again, going to be a quicker video. I do have a whole series of videos, a playlist about Dragon Magazine, where I'm going essentially every issue. I've done all the strategic review issues 1 through 7. And then I think I'm up to issue number 11, I'm pretty sure, of going through each issue of Dragon Magazine. I usually do 2 or 3 at a time. Now, in this particular case, I'm not going to be going through the entirety of these 2 issues. I'm going to be looking at issues number 20 and number 30. And specifically, I'm just pulling out the Halloween-themed content in them, again, just in honor of the Halloween season this year. So let's go ahead and dive in. And so first off, we have this cover here on issue number 20. Now, interestingly, this is from November of 1978. We'll address that in a second. But you see down here, it says horrible Halloween issue. And then it says more witchcraft in D&D. Now, we actually have already talked about that article. That was part of my article or my video on the history of witches in Dungeons and Dragons. But then it says demonology. So that's really where we're going to kind of focus in this particular issue. But I wanted to lead off with this really nice cover art here. Now, this is by Elro here, which is I guess pen name. It's an artist name that this particular person used. I want to say his first name was Ken. I think it's Ken Rahman, Rahman, I believe, but went by the artist name of El Rohir. And this, you've got this haunted carriage here, very classic scene, and it's very Halloween themed, so it fits appropriately with their horrible Halloween issue. It's just interesting that it's from November instead of October. Now, El Rohir had done quite a few covers for Dragon magazine in the past, so up until this point, I think that at this point, El Rohir has now become, as of this issue, like the most prolific cover artist for Dragon. It's going to do a few more in the next few coming up issues, including issue number 30 that we're going to look at in a second. Okay, so really quick, I just want to point out why this is a Halloween themed issue, even though it's from October. And here the Dragon Rumbles, which is sort of like the editorial introduction by Tim Kask, who's the editor at this time. He says, who, for those of you who might have guessed from the last issue, we found it necessary to make some changes. But then he said, you might wonder why we waited until after Halloween to do this issue instead of doing it last month. Good question. And he says, now for the good answer. November's always seemed to me the dreariest month of the year. It's cold, damp, windy, dying, and not quite winter, but certainly not autumn. A good month for horror stories, and that debuts with All Hallows Eve on November 1st. November is bleak, dismal, and dreary, and it must have been Poe's favorite. So, that's his excuse for doing that. One has to wonder, though, if it just came down to timing and they couldn't get it done on time. Who knows? Because it is a little odd to call this the Halloween issue and have it debut in November. Okay, so the articles that are Halloween themed in this issue, again, are going to be this one here, A New Look at Witches in D&D. And again, we've already talked about that. And then down here, we see in the variants section, there's going to be an article on demonology and then an article on demonic possession. And those are the two that we're going to talk about right now. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to increase the size just to make it easier for me to read. Also, probably makes it easier for you as well. So this is the D&D variant, Demonology Made Easy, or How to Deal with Orcus for Fun and Profit. Early Dragon magazines often had little goofy titles like this, very tongue-in-cheek, intended to be kind of funny, and this one is no exception. So this article is by Gregory, I'm going to say Rhin, R-A-H-N, if that's not correct and somebody knows, definitely correct me in the comments. But Gregory, basically what I know of him as far as his RPG career is that he wrote quite a few articles in Dragon magazine. And they're going to talk about one of them here in this editor's note, which was a piece on lycanthropy. I want to say that was Dragon number 14. And then he's going to write another one on humanoids and sort of like trying to apply a scientific viewpoint, which is what all of his articles really end up doing. They're trying to apply a scientific way of looking at D&D, terms or tropes or whatever you want to call it. So the one on humanoids is really sort of about how all those different humanoid races could kind of exist and where they would come from. And then he's going to do one on dragons. And that one, if I recall, was a little bit more about like how to successfully attack a dragon, like what they might be, weakened by and all this kind of stuff. So, but very much written in the scientific vein. And you can see that here in this editor's note. It says the author may be familiar to you from the excellent piece on lycanthropy that we published a few issues back. Publishing his second piece should be taken by the readers of TD. And again, if you're new to this and you haven't seen my dragon videos before, TD means the dragon. That's what this magazine used to be called. And before it was, just known as Dragon or Dragon Magazine, it was called The Dragon. And so whenever you see TD, that's what that means. For what it signifies, not that the author is necessarily an expert on D&D, but rather that the author possesses both a vivid imagination and a rational, logical approach to implementing it. The author does have an excellent grasp of D&D to my mind, and I can't help but feel that his campaigns would be highly challenging and entertaining. It is the combination of imagination and logic, however odd that couple may seem, that marks the exciting games as different, a cut above the rest. So, okay, that's the editor telling you that he likes this particular author. And this is a kind of an interesting article because it does try to present demonology in, again, this sort of like logical fashion as far as how you could apply not necessarily scientific principles, but more realism, I guess, if you want to call it that, which is a huge thing in these early years of Dungeons and Dragons. People wanted their games to be more realistic. And it still is something that people talk about. And to this day, you'll hear people saying like the combat system's not realistic and how they have way better ideas for making it more realistic. And it's the same ideas people have been proposing for 50 years. There's really nothing new there. But in any event, it's trying to bring some sort of historical viewpoints on demonology as well. So he talks about like Solomon, and he's going to talk about the Seal of Solomon later on in this particular article. But he says in Earth's past, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but just the introduction here. In Earth's past, real researchers came into the arcane arts. Real researchers into the arcane arts spent their time in attempting to rediscover the supposed secrets of the ancients. Among these were the Philosopher's Stone, which would transmute base metal to gold, the Elixir of Life. The more daring attempted to replicate the experiments of Solomon the Wise by summoning up the fallen angels and causing them to do the mage's bidding. It was thought that these beings would then impart knowledge to the operator, show him the location of hidden treasure, and employ their unearthly powers in his service for a price. And then it goes on to say, well, D&D magic users have other more immediately rewarding enterprises like spell research and the manufacture of magic items, and then also just adventuring in general. But then he says, with the demonic hierarchies that are laid out in the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Monster Manual, which at this point is about a year old. At the point of this publication, November of 1978, the Dungeons & Dragons Advanced Monster Manual has been out for about a year, 1977. And so, and that one really expanded the difference between demons and devils and started to categorize them and added more than we'd seen before. There had been a bunch that had been debuted in Eldritch Wizardry, which was supplement 3 for original Dungeons and Dragons. But in this particular case, the Monster Manual did even more on top of that. And so he says, in the interest of simplicity, he's going to refer to the summoned beings as demons, although most of what is written might be applicable to demons, devils, and such similar beings as night hags. And then he says, where differences should occur, they are noted. So the article is going to be divided up into a few main sections that are going to involve, first, how to learn the name of the demon or devil, whatever it is that you're trying to summon, and the process for going through that, which is interesting and actually is something that could be applied to any edition of Dungeons & Dragons, because it uses terms of game mechanics that, while those actual mechanics might have been different in previous editions, they still exist just in a different form. So specifically, it's using spell research as a proxy for figuring out the name of the creature that you're trying to summon. So you could do, every edition of Dungeons & Dragons has some kind of rules on how to do spell research. And then it's going to talk about, the expenses behind that, and then an actual ritual, and it gets into sort of the implements and the vestments that you need to wear, which I think is really cool. And again, that's all flavor stuff that can be applied regardless of the edition that you're playing. And then it is going to get into things like, how many assistants do you need and what kind of sacrifices do you have to make? And again, mostly that is not mechanical in nature. It's stuff that could be applied to any edition. And then it gets into things like the bargains and the pacts that you're making, what happens if you fail, all this kind of stuff. So, while this was written, at this point, it's over 40 years. So like 45-ish years ago, 46, it can, the ideas in here are extremely applicable to, like I said, other editions of Dungeons and Dragons. So even if you're playing 5th edition, don't ignore some of these old articles of D&D, because one, you'll get exposed to how the game has progressed and changed over time and where ideas came from. But two, you're going to find actual practical advice that you can use to kind of spice up your games and make them different. Okay. So again, it talks about trying to figure out the name of the demon or devil that you're trying to summon. And it mentions how the common names that we know, like Orcus or Demogorgon, those are not the names by which those creatures would be compelled to appear. So it's not just as easy as looking through the monster manual and figuring out what that name is, because those aren't the ones that you're going to use. You're going to have to find the actual proper names. And he says they change each 70 years, whereupon new names must be researched and all pacts renewed. So I thought that's kind of interesting. I don't know why it's 70 years. I'm not sure if that's coming out of some kind of actual earth text that somebody wrote and said that when they were trying to, create some kind of demonology text, or if it's just he wrote that for this article. Now, it is interesting that this article, it's appearing at a time before the satanic panic had happened with D&D, but it's going to happen pretty quickly within a year or two after this article is published. So you're not going to see articles like this from official D&D sources and publishers for very much longer. So this is existing at a point in time that it really couldn't have happened at any other point, because it's after the monster manuals come out. So you have that larger list of demons and devils and creatures like that. But it's pre the satanic panic, where seeing an article like this about how to do demonology, people would have pointed to this as an excuse for why D&D is bad. Okay. Which is just crazy, because obviously this is a game, but some people actually thought that this was teaching you how to do this kind of thing, like as though it's real. So it talks about that, and then it says that lesser demons have individual names, do not have individual names, but if you summon them, you can assign them a name, and then it increases their status in the hierarchy of wherever they're located, whichever plane that they're on. And that is something that you might want to do, because you're trying to get the reason you're summoning these creatures usually is because you want them to do a favor for you. So then it talks about researching them through the as though they were magical spells of the appropriate level. And I think that that's really interesting. It's not something I necessarily would have thought of, but using a game mechanic to help replicate the idea of researching a name of a summoned creature. And then it changes, obviously by level. So demon princes and archdevils names are treated as though they were 9th level, whereas a type 1 would be treated as 3rd level. So, and then everything in between. And then it talks about the expenses that have to go into this when you're researching and doing your name research. And so it talks about the demon will know whether or not the operator is properly protected. And if not, there's a very good chance that it will appear and snatch the operator back to its own plane. Later on in the article, he's going to say that when he says operator, what he means is the cleric or the magic user that is doing the summoning, because it could be either one. It could be a cleric or magic user. And rather than saying the cleric or magic user, he just uses the word operator to mean both. So, and then it goes into, the types of level of creature that you're trying to summon, and, your chances of what you're going to actually get based on how much you're spending. And then he talks about using the demon generation charts from the Dragon number 13, which was a really fun article. I think, if I recall, that was by John Pickens and repeated in Best of Dragon Volume 1, which I really liked that one. And so then he talks about each level allows a small chance that the being whose name has been divined is a unique individual created from the generation chart. So they will primarily be demons rather than devils, because devils, being lawful and orderly in their fashion, tend to hate and loathe that which is different. So that's fine. And then talks about if the operator has researched a name that is beneath his notice, he must begin again. There has to be a ritual involved for the summoning of the named demon. And remember, in this case, when he says demon, he means demon or devil or whatever it is you're trying to summon. He's using it generically, not as a specific thing. And then he talks about you have to prepare for the ritual, which includes obtaining implements, investments, assistance, and the sacrifice. So the implements is really fun. He talks about you need a sword, daggers, wands, a brazier, the proper woods and herbs to burn, incense, a censer, holy water, chalk, ink, pens, parchments, goblets, and other tools of the art in capital A. So again, there's nothing there that is a mechanic, but the idea of that list of all the things that you need to be involved in. And these are all things that you've seen in classic, whether it's books or other kinds of fiction media, movies or shows where people are summoning creatures like this. You see that all, drawing the circle with the chalk and all those kinds of symbols that you have to have for protection and all this types of thing. So, but I've never really seen that listed before in other things. So this is just adding a little bit of depth, a little bit of creativity, and helping you describe what you have to go through to do this type of thing. And then how much money you'd have to plan. It says the operator should plan to invest from 1 to 4,000 gold pieces per spell level of the ritual. So this is all just to figure out the name. Okay, and then you have your assistants and your sacrifices. So it talks about how many assistants that you need. So a 5th level conjuration requires 1 assistant, 6th level 2, 7th 3, 8th and 9th requires 4. But later on, it's going to say the more assistants you have, the higher chance there is of there being a screw up when you're doing your summoning, and it could cause a failure. So I believe it's like 5% per number of assistants. So that is kind of interesting, but it makes sense, right? Because you have people that are lower level than you who are helping you, and they might not know everything that you do. And so the chances of them screwing up is much higher. So I kind of like that idea that the more assistants you have, the higher chance of failure there is. You would think intuitively, you'd think it'd be the more you have, the more help you're getting, and it would be better. But this is twisting that so that there's a chance that they might make a mistake. And then it talks about you have to provide them implements, investments. The one thing it doesn't do is ever tell you like what kind of investments you need. It just says that you need them. I think it would have been neat if they'd kind of help describe some of the different types that you might wear. I mean, the classic, of course, is like the black hooded robe, but I feel like they could have done better than that and maybe help describe that a little bit more. And for all these, again, this is a sign of the times. It's just, this is all presented as a giant wall of text, but having some tables in here to throw that's off to like a table for the different types of items that you need, like the implements. There was that long laundry list, but it might have been neat to say at lower levels, you only need a few of those, a lower level type of creature that you're summoning. And then at higher levels, you need, at the highest level, you need all of them. And then the types of vestment, maybe the color makes a difference if you're summoning a demon versus a devil, or, again, just kind of the symbolic nature of the vestments that you're wearing and what that might mean. Again, I think that could have helped, and it would have been interesting to have some of that listed in here. And then it says, depending on, if you're a good person who is summoning this thing, you and if you do not desire continuing relations with the demon, you might demand one service without a sacrifice under the threat of cursing the demon to torment, part of the ritual which assures the being's good behavior if all else is correct. And then in order to summon the being in the future, you would have to repeat the ritual, but you would want a sacrifice. If you are evil and you want to call on this creature that you've summoned again, you need to have a sacrifice ready. And then it goes through this whole thing talking about how you should just have it on you at all times. Whatever it is that you've promised to sacrifice, you should always have it, so that if you ever need to, like on the fly, summon this creature, maybe hunt planned ahead of time, you have the thing with you, because they will not do the thing for you if you don't sacrifice first. And then it even goes on to say, like, if the thing you're asking them to do is to kill these people that are trying to kill you or attack you or whatever, the sacrifice can't be one of those beings, because that's what you're asking them to do, and it won't work without payment. And so it's always saying how the thing that you're summoning is trying to twist, just like a wish being granted, right? It's trying to twist what you're asking them to do so that it is to their advantage, and so they're not going to work for free. So killing a thing and then having that thing they kill be the sacrifice, that's working before they've been paid, right? So, and then it talks about bargains and pacts. So this is a really interesting section. And again, it's talking about how there can be, they're bargaining of it, making a pact, attempting to get as much from the operator as possible in return for as little actual work as they can. So all of that makes sense. And that's classic. Again, the classic stories that talk about the dangers of summoning things like this is that it often backfires on you unless you're super careful and specific about how you ask for the thing that you want and ask them to do the thing that you need them to do. And so it says that, things like granting them service is as payment is a thing that most of these types of creatures want. And it can be as little as a few years. It could be 100,000 years. It could be just 1,000. It could be eternity. And it talks about how if you've promised something to one, another demon won't come along and ask for something else. Like a lot of time, depending on their level and their hierarchy and their order. So all of that's it's really cool. It's interesting. It's very, very flavorful. And again, no game mechanics here whatsoever that you couldn't use in any other edition of Dungeons and Dragons. So then it talks, this art here, this is going to be by David Trampier. Down here, you see his signature. And then it says higher level types. It's kind of hard to read because it's written over the art. Can supply the operator with a familiar imp or quasit, or give him a crystal ball or a speculum by which he can contact lower planes. Succubi can be very valuable in the opera. Okay, so it just talks about like what they can do. Then it goes into how these summoned creatures are going to appear. And it says usually it's enough to just speak their name and then the command appear and they will show up. But then it talks about how princes and archfiends generally will only appear at a prearranged time, like a sacrificial rite or when the operator is in dire straits, though sometimes not even that. And then again, it talks about how their goal is to take the operator's soul and they don't really care how they get it. So they're only going to preserve the operator if it's in their interest to do so. They don't really care at all about the operator, but, they're held to the bounds of the contract and the bargain that they made to uphold their end of it. Although, again, they're going to try to do as little as possible to meet the spirit of what was intended. And then it talks about how, these creatures might grant them immunity from or control over their other earthly servants. So Orcus is the Lord of the Undead. So you might ask him to protect you from the undead. And then this spells it Jubilex, which is how I always said it when I was a kid, but I believe that is the incorrect spelling, and it's actually Juiblex. But whatever, it talks about King of Slimes and Enogthu being the Lord of Gnolls and Ghouls and things like that. So those are the things that you could ask those particular demon or devil, to protect you from. And then it says you can only sell your soul for eternity once, but you can bind yourself to as many years of service as you want, and terms of service always run consecutively. So you could, in theory, indenture your soul to a pit fiend for 100,000 years and then make a separate deal with Asmodeus to serve him for all eternity, which you would do after your 100,000 years of serving the pit fiend. So, it goes on to talk just, more detail on that kind of thing. And then it gets into exorcism, which is fun, kind of interesting. And it says one ritual dealing with demons that clergy are more often called upon to do is that of exorcism. So it's similar to the summoning ritual, but it's the opposite. So you're commanding them to depart from the person, place, or thing that they've been possessing. So this is this article's view on exorcism. We're going to see another one from a different author later. But for now, that's how this one's doing it. And it says the difference lies in that the exorcism is a generalized ritual in which the name of the being need not be known, as there is generally not time to research it. So it has a 50% chance of succeeding against a type 3 demon or below, but 25% on types up to and including type 6, and then a 10% on princes. And it says knowing the name of the being increases the chances of success by 40%. Okay, and then it gets into failure. So this is a fun section, and again, I think it would have been much more fun had it been a table that had a lot of other types of random things that could go wrong for failing. But the failure here basically ends up being, it's a total fizzle, which means nothing happened. And then the other things are usually, well, the thing that you wanted doesn't appear, but like a lower level one appears and it's not controlled. Or a lower level one appears and it is controlled, but it's not what you wanted. Or the one you wanted appears, but it's not being controlled. Or a higher level one appears and it's not being controlled. So the main thing that's going to happen here is either the one you wanted doesn't show up, or it does show up, or something even better shows up, but it's not controlled, and that's bad. You don't want that. So, and then you see here, it says for each level that the operator is below 20th, there's a basic 5% chance of failure. So you want to be really high level when you attempt this. And then again, there is a 5% chance for each assistant required per assistant. So a roll of not controlled means the demon is not bound by the summoning spell and free to act as it chooses. And then it talks about using reaction dice. So I talk about this all the time because it's one of my favorite things to use in these early style games. And you could 100% use it in any edition. But this is when you roll 2d6, you add your charisma bonus. Now, charisma bonuses in the older editions were not as high as they are in, say, 5th edition. So you might want to mitigate that a little bit. But the idea is that you're creating a bell curve as opposed to a linear D20 roll. You could do it with the D20 against a target number, but doing it as a bell curve means that most of the results are going to end up in the middle, which is going to be sort of like, they're indifferent. And then that's when you use your charisma bonus to kind of help push it over the edge if you can. So, but again, using that to deal with these types of creatures is a fun idea. And so, and then it says there's no higher or lower demon. If there's no higher or lower demons than the one that's summoned, treat the results as with the appearing demon being a different one of the same or similar level. So that's that. And then you have this fun cartoon here, which is thematically appropriate because it says, now that's what I call a random demon. And they're looking over here at this little crazy thing walking by. Now, this is by Will McLean. Did a lot of cartoons like this in the 1979 Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide, but he also did cartoons like this in Dragon during this time period. All right, now this article is actually going to continue, even though it doesn't say that, but it's going to continue a few pages later. I'm not going to go through this whole magazine, but I do want to point out really fun. I think this is interesting. So if you see this picture here in the upper left-hand corner, this is from Gen Con. Is it 11? It's hard to see because that's in the middle. I want to say that's 11, not 10. But they talk about the guest of honor being J. Eric Holmes, who's right here. So obviously the editor of what people call the Holmes edition or the Blue Book edition of Basic D&D from 1977. Well, this is his son, Chris, right here. So Chris often, well, not often, but has at least a couple of times commented on my videos when I've been talking about the Holmes edition or things from that era. And he'll talk about like, oh, my dad was trying to do this, or like my dad often said he wished that he'd done this, this, and this. So it's really fun. There are industry people from the TSR era days that often come into the comments on the videos. So make sure that you go through the comments and read those because you'll see that from time to time. And it's really fun when those people pop into the comments. So I just wanted to point that out really quick, but I want to go to the conclusion of this article. So that's here, Demonology from page 15. And then it talks about, this is the warnings, right? So it's not advisable that the glory and or experience hungry operator attempt to summon up Orcus and try to do to him while he is confined in the magic circle. So any attack upon the demon voids the control and the demon is free to reply as he sees fit. If you can leave the imprisoned demon in the magic circle, but and they're saying like, oh, that might seem like a good thing to do if you're good aligned, like you're trying to like put them in a place where they can't act and operate and do anything. But then it results in the creation of an eternally dangerous spot. And then if something or someone should stumble onto to otherwise break the circle, then that's bad because then the demons can immediately seek out the person that trapped them there. So again, another classic trope from this style of fiction where, you have that circle of chalk and you see it coming, like, especially in movies where the person's foot or hand or bottom of their cloak or whatever it is, like rubs across that chalk circle that they might not even know was there and accidentally, breaks it and brushes it out of the way. And then the big creature appears. So that's a fun image that you can use in a game session. So you could put a circle like that and the demon inside, it says it could be in shadow or it could be invisible. It could be all kinds of things where you don't even know that something's there. And maybe the characters don't know what this circle is and they accidentally break the circle. And then part of the adventure is for them to track this thing down and put it back or however, send it back to where it came from, that kind of thing. And then he talks about this secret seal of Solomon, which I talked about at the beginning of this section. And then it says, other questions can be solved by negotiation between the operator and the demon, such as how many times can the operator be resurrected before the demon claims his soul? What about a residual clause allowing the operator to return to Earth as a specter? That kind of thing. And then oddly enough, I don't know why, but then it goes to some italic type. In the case that the demon is commanded without sacrifice, the demon will be as literal-minded and treacherous as possible, doing anything he can to louse things up within the wording of the command. The demon vanishes immediately upon completion of the order. And then it says footnote 2. I'm not sure what footnote 1 was, unless it was that part that we just read and they forgot to label it. But just very typical of this time. I think they're rushing to get this thing out, and oftentimes things just kind of go past the editors. So, and that's, it's understandable. It was a small operation. So footnote 2 is on the invocation of deities, and it basically says that you can do the same process that they talked about for summoning a demon or a devil and use it to summon a deity if you follow all those steps, and then treating, what level you would treat a god as. Gods should be treated as princes, and then demigods as one level lower. And then it talks about the implications that would happen, because it would probably be seen as blasphemy. Churches and religious institutions that worship those deities that you decide to, on your own go summon, they're not going to be happy, and they're going to probably try to hunt you down. And so I thought that was an interesting little end to this article about, again, some world building things that could happen if people are summoning deities using this process. Of course, the churches that are behind those deities that worship them would not be super happy about that. And then it says organized priesthoods take a very dim view of the attempted invocations of their deities by outsiders, even if it's successful. So rules of invoking the god can be found in the holy books of the temple if you have access to or can steal them. But vengeance often dogs the heels of thieves and desecrators. Beware. And that's it. It's kind of like a weird, wrapped up, very quick end to this article. But again, I think there's a lot of really fun stuff in here that can be used in a game where, maybe a higher level game, where you're trying to figure out ways to challenge your players and do add some of these descriptions into your section in your session when you're talking about demons, demonology, and that kind of thing. Okay, apologies if there's a slight change in audio quality here. I forgot to plug my microphone into my phone on the last little segment that I did, but I fixed that now, so hopefully this part is better, or at least it's not a huge change. Okay, so this is the next article. This is also from issue number 20, another D&D variant, as they say, and that's demonic possession in the dungeon. Now, just so you know, the reason they're saying D&D variant here is because at the time the magazine was trying to be a lot of different things. It wasn't trying to be only a gaming magazine. There was fiction a lot. There's not fiction in this particular issue, but Tim Cass was a big fan of putting fiction into Dragon Magazine. And so it was trying to kind of be an all-encompassing thing for fans of sorcery and sword and sorcery and science fiction and Dungeons and Dragons and gaming in general. So they have to call out when something says like D&D variant, it's to let you know that this article is about D&D. As time goes on, the majority of the content in the magazine is going to shift to being just Dungeons and Dragons. But back in the time, they wanted to put it in its little section here. Okay, so this is by Charles Sagui. I really don't know how to pronounce that name, so I'm very apologetic if I butchered that. But Charles, as far as his role-playing game career as a creator, content creator, and writer, mainly it's going to be articles in magazines. So wrote for Alarms and Excursions, the fanzine, wrote for Judges Guild Journal, and then did a few articles for Dragon Magazine. So one of his, I guess you'd call it, again, famous, and I use that word loosely, but, one of the articles that people sort of would remember Charles from was an article specifically entitled Why Clerics and Magic Users Can't Use Swords. And that's been a question that's plagued a lot of people for a long time since the beginning of the game, is why is that the case, that they can't do that? Now, it's done for game mechanics and game balancing purposes, and the in-world flavor as to why has not always matched up to the mechanical game balance reason why. And so anyway, that's what his article is about. But he also did one on poisons, a very cool one on poisons and how to apply the rules from poison and make it a little bit more friendly for the game. Friendly in terms of ease of use and that kind of thing. So, but this one is about demonic possession. So it's interesting that they got two articles about demons. I'm assuming that they came in at different times and then they just held on to them so that they could put them both in this one issue. But this one is different because it's not about summoning a demon. It's basically about having a demon show up and then possess you. And it talks about how it can really liven things up for a party of lawfuls who are getting along in a dungeon, because we don't want them to get along. We want them to have, conflict. And so it says only demons of level 4 or greater and the princes are capable of possessing bodies of adventurers. And that it says the rule of thumb is that only those demons that are immune to all but magical weapons and therefore exist upon 2 planes at once may possess. So what he's talking about was this theory in early days that magic weapons have properties that allow you to hit things that are coexisting on two different planes at once. That's what the magic is doing. The mundane part of the weapon is hitting the thing that exists on the prime material plane, and then the magical quality of the weapon is hitting a part of that creature that exists on more than one plane, or it exists on another plane, like, but at the same time. So it's never really called out and explained that way, but that was something that a lot of people understood back then, and so that's what he's talking about. It's kind of cumbersomely worded, but that's what this is about. So the corporeal body of the demon is sent to another plane, while the spiritual essence remains in a room, cave, dungeon hall, or other area. The amulet of the demon must remain on the plane and world in which the possession takes place. So again, there's a lot of very clunky wording here, but it's just an interesting idea. It's interesting as far as figuring out who it's going to possess. And it says, like, the demon should be placed by the DM. The member of the party should be affected, who's going to be possessed, should be random. And so you can decide ahead of time. Is it the first person to enter the room? Is it the last person to enter? Is it the fourth person? It could be the first magic user to come in, or whatever it is, right? So you've decided that ahead of time, but then your party is deciding who's going to go first, and they don't know that you've put that rule in place. So it's random. You're not singling somebody out. And then it says, once the victim's been decided, all the members of the party are told that they feel an oppressive presence, and they all have to make a saving throw. That way, none of them knows which one's being affected. Because if you just ask the affected person to make the saving throw, everybody knows whose character's been affected. And then it talks about having to save versus spells. Now, this is interesting because it's going to get into later where you're fighting against a repossession, and then that's going to be a save versus death because you know that it's coming. In this case, it's save versus spells because you don't know that it's coming. Paladins and clerics get a bonus, and princes cause you to take a minus or a penalty on your saving throw. If the save's made, no one in the party is possessed. Only one demon will inhabit a body at one time. So it just talks about that. And then it gets into what are the effects of the possession. What happens if you're possessed by a demon? And then it goes. So there are some mechanics here, but again, the explanation could be applicable for any edition. You get the same armor class as the victim before being possessed. You can use any weapon except those that are aligned to lawful creatures. So what that means is good. But remember, in this case, although Advanced Dungeons and Dragons has come out at this point, most people were still using the 3-point alignment system of chaos, neutrality, and lawful. There was no lawful good or chaotic evil or anything like that. Now, those are in the monster manual that had come out, but it's only been out for a year, so a lot of people still weren't using that yet. So they attack using whatever weapons as whatever level demon that they were, rather than the level of the victim. And then the demon retains all of its powers except for the ability to gate, and they can't do things that are precluded by its new shape. So they can't fly without wings. And it says, or no Balrog emulation. So Balrog is going to be a type 6 demon or a Balor. So again, if you recall some of my previous videos, early D&D used a lot of what people would now consider to be copyrighted or trademark terms from the Lord of the Rings books, and the also the group that was managing like the movie rights. And so at the time, like in the original Dungeons and Dragons, they actually used the word Balrog. That's later changed to Balor or type 6 demon. Okay, and then it says once possessed, the person will either at once fight to the death or continue with the party, feeling no effect until the possessing demon chooses to take control. So they'll react to holy water. There's a weird section here. It says, except for a few extreme cases of females, there is little reaction to the presence of the cross. I have no idea why that's in there. I'm sure there's some kind of, fictional story-based reason why that's in there, but I am not aware of that. So as far as demonic possession. So, I mean, it's possible that I don't know what year, and I just forgot the name. What's the Exorcist? I don't know. Has The Exorcist come out by the time that this article came out? maybe that's what that's in reference to. I'm not really sure. But then it says paladins with their power to detect will recognize possession immediately. And then if detected, the possessing demon will attack. So it talks all about that. And it says restraints almost impossible because they can break any ropes or leather restraints. And they can only be restrained by 2 or more fighters with a strength of at least 18 and then 01. Again, if you remember your early Dungeons and Dragons, fighters who rolled an 18 strength using 3d6 were allowed to then roll percentile dice to see how much higher than 18 they got. So they didn't go to 19, they go to 18, somewhere between 0.1% to 100%. And 18, 100% was like the highest that you could get as a human fighter. So then it talks about fighting them, spells being cast, that kind of thing. And then it talks about exorcism. So this is the part that I wanted to talk about because it handles it differently than is handled in the other articles. So it says every 5 rounds after 2 rounds of preparation, so that means no fighting, a cleric can attempt to exorcise the demon, which is essentially using their turn undead ability. So if you remember in the other article, the exorcism took the place of sort of like spell research on the fly. This one is based on a cleric turning undead. And so if a turn away is indicated, the demon's expelled and acts as if the body was killed except for further attempts of possession. If dispel is indicated, the demon is expelled and banished to the plane upon which its corporeal body rests. So and then it talks about if the amulet of the prince or demon is found, then he can be ordered to return to his body in whatever plane it is lodged and leave the victim unhurt. And there's all these things about if the victim's hurt or unhurt and what that means. And remove curse or limited wish can occasionally work, but a full wish is more effective. And but the demon gets a save. Princes get a plus on their saves. And then the effects of exorcism. It's painful for the cleric. It's a painful process for the cleric and the victim. So the cleric, again, has to spend 2 rounds not fighting. And then each attempt at exorcism costs 1 to 6 hit points of damage. And then the victim reacts in one of 3 ways. Is free and can take 1 to 10 points of damage, 55% chance, or he can go insane and be treated in the usual ways, which is 25% chance, or can drop dead, 20%. If death results, revival may be attempted. If a demon is exorcised by use of his amulet and the command is phrased correctly, then there's no damage to the victim from the exorcism. And then the closing comments is that there's no treasure in the room in which the possession takes place. So again, this is written in the standpoint that you're stalking a dungeon, and this is something that you would have rolled up to have a demon be in this room. And so you're not going to have the standard treasure in there because this is a demonic possession. So, and because their wealth is on the plane of where they put their corporeal body. So the demon possessing a human is not looking for a home. It's feeling that they're taking over the body is to basically just cause pain and trouble. So, and then it ends again. We're trying to be a little funny here. Always pay the bills when exercised, or the finance company will repossess you. So that's the end of that particular article on demons. Now we're going to go to the one on vampires, which is going to be in Dragon issue number 30. Okay, so Dragon issue number 30. This is from October of 1979. So at this point, all 3 of the original Advanced Dungeons & Dragons hardback books are out, or would closely be out. Dungeon Master's Guide is published in 1979. That was the last of the 3. And you have this fun cover here again, and this is by Elro here again. So it's interesting to see the progression of the covers that he does for Dragon, because I feel like this one is perhaps the most, I'm going to use the word realistic, but just it doesn't have quite that ethereal sort of, if you look at this cover over here, let's go back really quickly to this one and look at this cover for issue number 20. You see, like, it's very like wispy, I guess, the colors, which I like it a lot. It's he tends to do things that are sort of in this vein, a little bit more symbolic than they are like trying to really capture the moment in a realistic way. You can see the trees here, like this castle back here in the background. But then you get to this one, and it's much more, I feel like it's much more detailed. Everything's clearer, crisper, and I say realistic. I mean, this guy's got this abnormally giant nose and the exaggerated wrinkles. Everything's slightly exaggerated, but still it's really fun. And all these little details, these spiders crawling over here, and this fun skull with the third eye and the fangs, and all these fun old books and all that kind of stuff. So again, another cover that I really like. I think it's cool. Okay, so you get into this one, and I'm not going to get into this too much right now, but this editorial does get into the beginnings of the Satanic Panic, and particularly deals with the disappearance of James Egbert, who that kind of was the kickoff for a bunch of people coming after Dungeons and Dragons. So that's a whole other thing. We can talk about that at another time, but that's the era that we're in. So remember me saying just a few minutes ago that those articles on like demon summoning and things like that you're not going to see those in future issues of Dragon Magazine. So we're getting into that era now. So it's not quite a year later. Well, it's a year later. It's 10 issues later, but a year later. All right. So the article that we want to talk about here is this one, Good Evening in Leomund's Tiny Hut. So let's get over there and have a look. And I'm going to, again, just increase the page size to make it easier for me and also you to read. But this is, Are You Wild About Vampires? Here's something to sink your teeth into. Welcome to Leomund's Tiny Hut. Now, Leomund's Tiny Hut was a ongoing column. It doesn't run every issue, but it runs in quite a few issues, by Len Lakofka. And it was one of the first ones that was dedicated to a specific author. So even Up on a Soapbox, or From the Sorcerer's Scroll, both of which people associate with Gary Gygax, those rotated people for a long time until it kind of became like Gary's thing. Leomund's Tiny Hut, specific to Len Lakofka, and always was. So now, we've talked about Len Lakofka before, but he's the guy who created the Lendor Isles, which are now part of Greyhawk, but that was originally his home campaign setting. So the Secret of Bone Hill classic module L1 from the early 80s, and that takes place in the Lendor Isles. And he was friends with Gary. Obviously, they worked together a lot, and he convinced Gary to basically put the Lendor Isles into Greyhawk, even though they weren't created with that in mind in the first place. So that's why those exist there now. So then Tim Kask, who's the editor, is going to say, I think it's Tim. Actually, it might have changed by this point. We'll get to that when we go through this issue in total. But he says, this is the first installment of what we plan to make into a monthly feature. From the title, you may notice a connection to AD&D. If you read the forwards and prefaces in a number of the D&D and AD&D books, you will notice the author's name mentioned in most, if not all of them. He can speak with authority is authenticated here. So they're basically just giving you the qualifications of why Len Lakofka is going to talk about this. Now, this particular one is going to be a mix of mechanics, but also some flavor things that you can do. But it's all about vampires and how to run them in a game. So he says there's so much information, but a lot is left unsaid and unqualified when the details of the play of the monster are studied. So that's what he's trying to do here, is give GMs ammunition and information on how to run an encounter or a string of an ongoing campaign with a vampire. So and this is based on his experience running them, and then he's giving you advice on like, this is how I handled this is how I did this. So he says that they have 8+3 hit dice, and they can have once their hit points are calculated, they never change. So once they regenerate, they just go back. Now that might seem like, of course that's what it is, but back then some people were confused and thought that every time the vampire regenerated after, it had been in its coffin, you had to re-roll the hit points again. So, and it talks about humanoids and demi-humans cannot become vampires. So you guys know I don't play 5th edition. I have the 5th edition Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. I don't actually have the 5th edition Monster Manual because I knew I wasn't going to use it. And so I'm actually not aware if other types of creatures can become vampires in 5th edition. But back then, 40 years ago, whatever, only humans could become vampires. And then it says, in theory, since the draining of a figure is due to the negative material plane force, a humanoid or demi-human drained by a vampire could become a lesser undead that exists on the negative material plane. However, that makes the vampire too strong and is not allowed. So he spends his whole paragraph to tell you how you could create a type of undead for humanoids and demi-humans that exist on the negative material plane. But then it says, but don't do that because it makes vampires too powerful. And then it says that most vampires don't want that many other lesser vampires under their control. And then he's giving you a way to limit it. So he said vampires should be limited to no more than 4 at one time. And he says if you don't observe that rule, then in a few short weeks, entire towns would be taken over by vampires. So he's just arbitrarily creating a number to say 4. I think it makes sense. And then he talks about how lesser vampires can't actually create other lesser vampires that are answerable to themselves. The lesser ones they create are only answerable to the original, what he calls full vampire. So it does start to get a little bit fiddly with all this difference between lesser vampires and what he calls, again, full vampires, and going back and forth and describing it. But the information is good. It's just, it gets a little cumbersome in the descriptions. So he says, how can you properly dispose of a being after it's killed by a vampire or a lesser vampire? Get rid of the body so that it doesn't arise as a vampire. And then he says it's a simple one and accomplishable by either separating the body and the head. You can burn the body. You can dispose of the body just as you would a regular vampire. Or if the body is drained of blood, and then either a blessed prayer, chant, or exorcism is said over the corpse. But then the DM can also come up with their own reasons. And then it says, talks about invisibility and how to see and see invisible. And then it says the other vampire forms are the giant bat and the gaseous cloud. And then he talks about how they can move in between those. So you see this section here, it says taking only 1 to 4 segments. So in advanced D&D, you had turns, you had rounds, and you had segments. So a segment was a subsection of a round. They get rid of that in future editions, which thank goodness, because you were counting segments within a round on things like, when is this spell? Like I cast the spell at the start of the round, but it takes however many segments to cast. And at what point does it actually go off? It was adding a whole level of excruciating detail that I really don't think was necessary. I know, and if you like that, that's awesome. I like BX, basic D&D, that didn't have that. So AD&D added segments, and of course, one of the reasons why it adds those is not necessarily to make it more, quote unquote, realistic. It's to help separate it from basic D&D, so Gary could claim that it was a different game. We've talked about that before. So he says, in the bat and cloud forms, the abilities of the vampire are at best poorly defined. And so then he says, okay, well, when you're in that form, bat or gaseous cloud, you can't drain, summon, charm, or use physical strength. And then he says changing to another form will cause all the carried items to change also. And then he tells you, as a bat, these are the characteristics, and this is how you act as a vampire in bat form, what they can and can't do. And it's a pretty long article. And then he talks about same thing for gaseous form. So when they're in gaseous form, what can and can't they do? The sense of vision's reduced in gaseous form, so it cannot see with 20/20 vision or with infravision. And the gaseous form can move at 6 inches, which is faster than a potion bestowed gaseous form. It has no hit dice, attack abilities, regeneration abilities, summon abilities, harm abilities, or drain abilities. Immune to all magic except fireball, lightning bolt, cold air elementals, and gust of wind. And then it talks about how it can reform when it's, even if it's scattered by, say, a gust of wind, how it reforms. And then it says the vampire is not killed unless exposed to sunlight or unless he or she was on the way back to his or her coffin because of a forced assumption of the gaseous form. So this is where it starts to get like there's so many exceptions, and they're all written in this giant blocks of text. So it's really hard to parse out the information that you need to figure this out. So the cloud can reform quickly. It can ooze through any space that's not airtight. And it says it can even seep through soil as long as it's not too moist. Because again, they can't cross running water. And then it says it's a wise decision to set the hit point total at which the vampire will automatically go to gaseous in the next melee round, because the vampire is, after all, a very intelligent monster and will not waste him or herself being forced into gaseous form if he or she can avoid it. During forced assumption of the gaseous form, the vampire is most vulnerable since he or she cannot do anything at all for 8 hours after entering his or her coffin in cloud form. So again, a lot of this stuff is things that have become standard for figuring out this stuff with vampires, but at this time it wasn't. And so here you have this creator saying, here's how I do it in my games. And then you can kind of see again the evolution of how future designers are going to go, oh, we should have talked about that. That should have been in here. So we're going to add this. Now, again, the layer of detail in here is probably a little more than is needed, but it's interesting just to kind of get the sense of like the kind of decisions that Len was making as far as running the vampires for his games. So he talks about concerning the immunities to various different kinds of spells and spell forms. So he says, we know that they're immune to sleep, charms, holds, poison, paralyzation, but he says it's in like manner, it's obviously immune to any kind of death magic. And then he says a logical extension of charms and holds would be that suggestion won't work. And then he says, however, arguments from two different points of view can be offered in the case of fear, confusion, magic jar, cause wounds, disease or blindness, friends, web, stinking cloud, enfeeblement, illusions, polymorphs, feeble mind, raised dead, reincarnation, power word stun, and a few others I have yet to run into. So these are all things that have come up during his campaign. And again, he's giving you how he ruled on these during the game. For each one of those spells, he's going to tell you how he thinks they should or should not affect vampires and what would happen. And what happens, like if it's a touch spell and you have to touch the vampire because it's draining your energy, so you are going to get drained even though you're casting an offensive spell on it, like that kind of thing. So it goes into all that, and then he talks about regeneration here. And this section is pretty fun. So it talks about how they can't regenerate in bat or gaseous form, and that it's possible deep underground regardless of the time of day. So and then he spends a lot of time talking about how these are not the vampires from Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is the advanced D&D vampire. So it's different. And one of the ways it's different is like it's draining you of energy by its connection to negative plane and coexisting with the negative plane, not just from biting you and sucking your blood. So they're giving it a completely different rationale for draining your energy. And then he talks about even if far beneath the surface of the ground, the vampire must return to the coffin eventually. I rule once each week. If the vampire doesn't return, either within a week if underground full-time, or each night if exposed to the outside, including seeing daylight, or within 3 hours of being reduced by melee damage to 0 points, the monster crosses over to the negative plane exclusively and cannot return. So again, there's it's interesting. It's just a little much. So then it talks about over here this part on what happens if you kill a human and the human's buried and then the unearth is unearthed the next night. How the figure's killed is one major contention. It's basically talking about how does it become a vampire. And then it says, does the figure die due to damage or due to being drained to 0 level? And there's a difference in Len Kafka's mind of how that happens. So if the figure dies due to damage, not all necessarily from the vampire, then the figure can retain its abilities from his or her former profession. So as an example, if a 12th level wizard is wounded by some form of attack and then is touched by a vampire such that he becomes a necromancer. So what does that mean? You have to remember that this is the time period where they used level titles. So when it says he becomes a necromancer, he doesn't mean a different class or different style of wizard. What he means is you go from being a 12th level wizard to a necromancer, which is the level title for a 10th level wizard, because a vampire touch drains 2 levels. So you go, all it means is you're going from 12th level to 10th level, but he didn't say that. He used the level title, which could be confusing if you're not familiar with that rule or that mechanic from original Dungeons & Dragons. Every level had a title associated with that. And a lot of times they would only use the title and not the actual level, like the number. So it says, but is also killed due to damage of the vampire's touch, then the resultant monster will be a lesser vampire who is also a necromancer. So again, very clunky wording to try to explain what's going on here. But it's interesting to have a spellcasting vampire, because that is, again, a classic in D&D. But back when this was done, nobody had really talked about how to do that. How does that happen? And then he goes into things such as, like, they can't use wands because wands require you to have human hands touching it because it needs a living hand, and the vampire's not living. So, a vampire who is also a magic user is still limited in terms of what they can do. So I think that's really interesting. It's an interesting way to look at it. I think it's probably a little too much of detail. But that's what this goes through. And then it goes into this whole section of describing what is a lesser vampire. And then it says exactly what is it. And then the quote from the monster manual is appropriately strength vampire under the control of its slayer. That's all it says. And so then he's giving you some rules here on how to understand what a lesser vampire would be and how, like, strong it's going to be. And he's getting into, like, does it have half hit points, or, is it half strength? Is it 3/4 strength? How long does it have to be away from its full vampire before it becomes independent and becomes a full vampire itself? That's this whole section here, which is, it's fine. Again, I think it's something that probably didn't need, a whole section like this, but I understand some people aren't able to come up with this on the fly or wouldn't know. And so he's giving you some rules for that, which can be helpful for people. And then he goes into summoning and charming and talks about what kind of creatures can they summon: bats, rats, wolves. And he's telling, like, how he limits it. He thinks it should be limited because otherwise the whole area is going to be overrun within, a few rounds. And so put limits on what they get. And then he says, bats, 90% of the time, they're going to be the mundane sort, but 10% of the time, they're going to be bigger or better. And then rats, 90% of the time mundane, but 10% of the time giant rats or giant Sumatran rats, he says. And then wolves, same thing. So most of the time, 70% is going to be in this number. However, 30% of the time you're going to get dire wolves. And then they get into the charm ability. And then when is a glance met and can it be avoided? So this is a really interesting and, again, very fiddly mechanic. He says, I use a D20 for the figure that's meleeing. Not even sure that that's appropriate word, but the figure it's fighting in hand-to-hand combat, meleeing the vampire, and he uses a 1d12 for the vampire. The case in which a vampire meets someone casually can easily be adjudicated. If the 12-sided die roll equals or exceeds the roll of the 20-sided die roll from the victim, then the glance has been met. If the vampire is surprised, the vampire uses 1d6, not 1d12. If the victim is surprised, they roll a d8 instead of a d20, and then the victim in melee can purposely avoid the glance by not facing the monster directly. Thus, the vampire will use 1d8 versus the player's 1d20. The player's then -2 to hit the vampire, and his or her armor class is 2 levels lower. The player can't hit his or her opponent as easily, and since his or her own anticipation when attacked in the melee is inhibited by not facing the monster, his or her armor class suffers. So the other thing here is the his or her. It just gets really cumbersome to read after a while. I applaud this is this is late 70s, and they were already recognizing that they didn't want to just use one pronoun. But it does get a little bit clunky to read in that manner. So again, I think good intentions, but whatever. Okay. So it says when a vampire does charm, the victim immediately ceases hostility. No verbal command need be given. Charm's far more powerful than a charmed person spell. Obvious self-destruction will not be allowed. Blah, blah, blah. It goes on. And then he says, hopefully I haven't missed too much. I don't think so. I don't think you missed too much. But every DM knows how inventive players can be. And that's what this really is. So again, these types of articles are written to help a DM understand how to adjudicate and come up with ideas to make challenges for your players who are super creative and are thinking of every little thing that they can do to get the advantage, which is what this original game, that's really how people played. The DM was trying to create these really interesting, intriguing, creative challenges, but the players were then trying to be creative in the way that they circumvented those challenges. And a lot of times, if the DM wasn't prepared for that, they might be stuck because they don't know how to react to that. And you don't want to say no, but a lot of times you don't know how to rule on it. And so these articles are written to help a DM get better at, like, how to deal with these kinds of things. So he says, a little common sense, regardless of what the textbooks omit or gloss over, is fully in the prerogative of the dungeon master. So that's going to be it really for this quick look at these articles on demonology and demonic possession and vampires and these early issues, these Halloween themed issues of Dragon magazine. So interestingly, this Dragon here, number 20 that we talked about, this is really the first kind of theme issue, unless you want to count. There was an issue that was dedicated early on to the game Empire of the Petal Throne. But, you know, if you want to look at a theme that goes beyond just a game as a theme, this is really the first one, issue number 20 here being the Halloween theme. Later on in later years, the Halloween theme is going to be like an annual recurring thing with appropriate covers and all that kind of stuff, just like they're eventually going to have their annual April Fool's issue in April. And for the first few years of the magazine's existence, they're going to have holiday issues in December for the Christmas season. But this was kind of like the first one. So, and it really kind of is showing how they're becoming a more, I guess, professional style of publication, and they're trying to do things that really get them, you know, noticed on the shelf and get readership. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Please let me know in the comments below if you like this kind of, I guess, deeper dive into these articles. Usually when I go through the magazines issue by issue, I don't spend as much time on a specific article like that. I would just give you the short synopsis. So let me know if you like this little bit of more in depth on these two. And also always feel free in the comments to let me know of a topic that you want me to discuss. Let me know if you like these history videos, if you are looking for another DM advice video. I've had people tell me straight up that they don't watch my DM advice videos because they've had all the advice in their career that they need and they don't ever need any more DM advice, which I think is an interesting take, and it's fine, you know. But, you know, I do try to mix it up from time to time. Let me know if you want to see another review, and if so, what for. I did get, like, you know, the new Knave from Ben Milton over at Questing Beasts. And I have helped kickstart a couple things that should be coming soon. So hopefully, you know, I could always review those if that's something of interest to you. But yeah, let me know in the comments below what you think. And while you're down there, you'll find places where you can join me on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. And you'll also find a link to my blog where I have shared content from time to time, usually for old school versions of D&D, but a lot of it is system neutral. And you'll find a link in the show notes to my shop where you can buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, notebook, similar kind of thing, as a way to help support me and my channel. And the other way, of course, that you can support my channel is by becoming a super fan. So hit that little heart icon with the $sign that's written, it's shown underneath the video. Especially, it's easier to find if you're on a desktop. But from there, you can contribute anything just as a way of saying thanks for me and my continued, you know, making of these videos. So if you are able to do that, I would really appreciate it, so I can start to try to upgrade my equipment from time to time. But in the meantime, I would like to say thank you so very much for watching. Happy gaming, stay safe, and I will talk to you next time. Now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this particular video. So drinking wise, I thought it would just be fun to show you this. So first off, my wife got this glass for me. She found it, I think at a flea market. But this is a glass from an old restaurant chain here in California. I think they also had a location in Arizona maybe, but called the Velvet Turtle. So it was created up in the Bay Area in 1965 and eventually became a chain. I think it had 20 or 21 restaurants, something like that, including down in my area, Los Angeles area. And then it was, so started around 1965, was sold in 1986 to the Marriott Corporation, who then pretty much immediately sold it to a private equity firm who did what private equity firms do, which was essentially just drove it into the ground, and it ended up going out of business. So I can't tell you how many clients I've had. You might remember I own a boutique ad agency. How many clients I've had over the years that have sold their business to a private equity firm, and to fix the firm, or to fix the company, the private equity firm decided to stop advertising because they looked at it as an expense, not an investment. And then the brand, or whatever it is, it stops making money, stops selling, loses to the competition. And then the private equity people go, how did that happen? Like, they can't figure out. Happens every time. The first thing they do is cut the advertising because they think that's going to save money. It's ridiculous. But anyway, I thought it was fun to have an old piece of memorabilia from a California restaurant. And then this is something I made myself. So I called this a house blend Amaro. So this is something anybody can do. And it's not super complicated. A lot of times bars will do this, if you've ever heard of an infinity bottle. But when you have just a little bit left in some bottles, you don't always want to have all those bottles on your bar because you're using up a lot of space. And so a lot of times, like, especially with whiskey, people will take the remnants of bottles of whiskey and put it all into one bottle and call it like a house blend whiskey. And it just is a fancy way of, it makes it sound like, oh, that's really cool. But it really, all you're doing is just mixing bottles together. And so I've done that before for parties and things like that, and said like, oh, you can't get this blend anywhere else, which is true. But I did that with some Amari. So my friend, one of my best friends, decided to stop drinking. So he's sober now, back in February, but he had just pretty big stash. And a lot of it was liqueurs. And so his partners brought a box over to me and asked me if I wanted any of them. And so I took a lot of his Amari. And then what I did was I poured them into my existing bottles. So like his bottle of Chinar was like half full. My bottle of Chinar was half full. So I just poured them together to make one full bottle of Chinar, so that way I don't have to have two bottles out. But he had a bunch of, individual bottles of things where he had like maybe less than a quarter of a bottle left. And I just don't have all that space in my bar. And I thought it would be a unique opportunity to kind of make a blended Amari. So I took, this is mostly a blend of 3 different Amari. It's Ciaro, Montenegro, and Braùlio. And I know I've talked about Braùlio on the channel before. And I believe I've also talked about Montenegro. And then I had Ciaro. So, and I put the 3 of them together. And so this is a blend of Amari that you can only get if you come over to my house. And it's not equal portions. And I didn't measure what the portions were. So I'm actually not sure. And I couldn't recreate it again because, I didn't pay attention to how much of each I was putting in there. But just something fun to do. Now, what you can do with this, it's intended to be a digestif, an after dinner sipper that you would just drink neat like this, or if you really wanted to, I guess you could put it on a rock. But the other thing you can do with something like this that's really fun is make a Manhattan where you swap out the sweet vermouth portion. So it's a sweet Manhattan. You'd swap that out for an Amari like this, and it just gives it a different layer of complexity. So proportions are the same, 2-to-1 whiskey to Amaro, just like you do 2-to-1 whiskey to sweet vermouth. So give that a try and let me know what you think. So cheers. Chin chin. That's perfect for a nice, cool fall day here. I feel like it's very warming. It's got the rich kind of caramely flavors, but it's got that bitter aspect that I really quite like. Okay, and then as far as albums, I was looking for another Halloween album, and I don't have a ton. And this one just caught my eye, so I had started listening to this. So I picked this up at Record Parlor in Hollywood a little while ago, and it was still in the shrink wrap. So you can kind of see, and it was sealed in the shrink wrap. I actually opened it. So this is from 1980 all the way back then. And there's some ringware because it's just been sitting there unused. But this is Paul Simon's One Trick Pony 1980. Now, this was his first studio album in 5 years, interestingly enough, and it represented a shift in labels. He moved over to Warner Brothers, and this accompanied a movie by the same name where he plays the title character in the movie called One Trick Pony. I've never seen the movie. It's been pretty much universally panned as not being great. Does represent the film debut of Lou Reed, interestingly enough, who plays kind of a schmarmy record executive in the movie. But this is essentially the soundtrack. And it says the music on this album was created for the Paul Simon movie, One Trick Pony. However, the versions that you hear on the album are not always the same. In many cases, they're quite different. And so this song, Late in the Evening, that was the main hit off of this album. I think it reached number 6 on the Billboard charts. But also the title track, One Trick Pony, I think got up to maybe number 20 or something like that, or at least got in the top 40. But Late in the Evening was the reason that I bought this album, because it's a fun song. I hadn't heard the whole album before, interestingly enough, before I even bought this. I couldn't pass it up for being, the price. It was $16 used, and it sounds perfect. I mean, it was sealed. So again, there's some ringware on the outer sleeve, but the actual vinyl was like pristine. I was super happy with it. And so I've been going back to it a lot just because it sounds so good. But it's just a really fun album. I really quite enjoy. I didn't come to Paul Simon until much later in life, like when Graceland came out, when I was kind of in that time period from going from high school to college. I remember Graceland had come out and I didn't like it at the time. I thought it was kind of, I called it old people music. And I had unfortunately, not very open mind about music back in those days. And I remember one of my dorm mates in college playing Graceland a lot. He really liked it. And so it just kind of seeped into my subconscious, even though I didn't really like it. And then, flash back until maybe just less than 10 years ago, I rediscovered Graceland and realized what a great album it is. And I've talked about it here on the channel before. And then that got me into exploring other albums from Paul Simon and his musical discography. So anyway, that's it for the bonus content. Let me know if you've heard this album before, what you think of it, or if you have other albums of Paul Simon's that you like. And that's going to be it. So again, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you have a happy Halloween coming up in a few days. And it's again October 28th of 2024. So and let me know what you're doing in the comments. Tell me what you're doing for Halloween, if you're doing anything. Maybe you're running a funny or a fun scary D&D session. Maybe you're going to do a scary movie marathon. Maybe you're taking your kids out trick-or-treating. Maybe you're just at home passing out candy, or maybe you hate Halloween and you're not going to do anything. Doesn't matter. Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Cheers. And I'll talk to you next time.